purpose. The social situation in the world with the rise of Nazism in Europe was happening. He went deep. He took a trip to Rome, apparently had significant impact on him that began a spiritual conversion, a religious conversion process for him. He returned from Rome uh, and had been visiting the campus ministry there at uh, Columbia University. Some of the, especially Catholic campus ministry, he was interested in Catholicism, started doing a lot of reading and supported by some of his friends to do that. Well, he eventually converted to Catholicism uh, and was baptized a Catholic at Christ the King uh, Church there at Columbia University. He completed his graduate studies, receiving a Master of Arts degree in English and his master's thesis on William Blake, the English author. Uh, After Columbia, he received a teaching position at St. Bonaventure University in New York State, central New York, keeping in contact with a lot of his professors, corresponding with them, visiting with them, and friends. Several of them came to Olean, to St. Bonaventure, to visit with him, and he continued his spiritual journey. Um, he decided to consider entering a religious order. He applied to the Franciscans who staffed St. Bonaventure University, um, and apparently he was denied entrance into the Franciscan order after he disclosed his personal history, especially in England and the death of a child and all that. They would not accept him. One of his professors uh, about in 1940, 41, suggested that he make a retreat at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky in the spring Easter break of his teaching. He did make a retreat at Gethsemane and was profoundly impacted by his experience there. He felt that he was called to be a monk. So he did apply, and on December 10th, 1941, he did enter Gethsemane. He began his monastic formation, and for several years he was writing, continuing to explore for himself his experiences. And then within about 3 years of his entrance at Gethsemane, his brother John Paul visited him. And John Paul also was converted to Catholicism and was baptized at the Abbey of Gethsemane. Later that year, Merton experienced another tragedy in his life. His brother John Paul, who had joined the Canadian Royal Canadian Air Force, it was a flyer. His plane was missing in action somewhere in the North Sea off the coast of Europe. I will share with you a poem later in the presentation about his brother, but that was profoundly difficult for him. The support of the monks at Gethsemane and the abbot helped him through that time. And Merton was a writer at heart. He couldn't keep his hands off of pen and typewriters. Um, he was asked by his abbot, after the abbot became familiar with Merton and his writings, to write his autobiography. And in 1948, he completed his autobiography, and it was published as it became a bestseller, The Seven-Storied Mountain. I remember reading it in high school and profoundly impacted me and my thinking too about faith, and just to learn about Merton's journey. So for the next, during the 50s, he continued to write. The abbot at Gethsemane made use of his intellectual skills. His first job, again, teaching, was to the what they call the scholastics. These were monks who were preparing for the priesthood, for ordination. So from 1951 to 55, that was his primary job at Gethsemane. In 1950, Merton had completed his seminary studies, his theology studies, and was ordained a priest, Catholic priest. So his writings in the early 50s were mostly spiritual, pious writings, both profound. He journaled all of his life. He began his journals when he was at Cambridge University in England, and all the early years at Gethsemane, he captured it all in what was published from his first journals, The Sign of Jonas. And it gives a lot of details about what he was experiencing in his life. In 1955, he became the Master of Novices at Gethsemane, and he held that job until 1965. From 1955 to 65, about 10 years. And he would give conferences to the novices and to the monks. Later, much later, in the 70s and 80s, all of those conferences he gave were taped, and they're available, and you really listen to the voice of Merton, his humor, and his subject matter, what he was presenting, were fantastic. And then in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, his whole concerns about the social situation in the United States, the civil rights movement, poverty, the war that was in Vietnam concerned him deeply, and he wrote about that. And we're going to read excerpts of his writings about that. He was very outspoken. Many times, a few times, he was censored for his political views. He turned a lot of traditional Catholics off from his beginning to articulate his concerns about racism and war. Uh, his first time that he said something that challenged the American Catholic bishops was way back in the 40s, when he was critical for the American Catholic bishops not being more uh, outspoken about the dropping of the bombs at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. He writes that in what was titled in his book, uh, Original Child Bomb. So uh, he made folks feel very uncomfortable, and both within the Catholic hierarchy, some of the monks at Gethsemane and the Cistercian order, and the government, U.S. government. There's suspicion that the FBI was keeping their eye on him. Uh, but as the 60s progressed, he started publishing one or two books a year. Uh, Topics that range from addressing the social issues at the time, spirituality, the contemplative life, contemplative experience. He also was quite a fan and wrote essays critiquing both American and English authors. William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Jacques Merton, the French philosopher, uh, Albert Camus. He was very fascinated by Boris Pasternak, uh, who wrote Dr. Zhivago. And he also corresponded with so many of these authors and with other figures in both government and so forth. It's amazing how much this man produced in terms of his literary contributions. Question was always asked, when did he ever have time to be a monk, to live the rule of Benedict as the monks did? But he, in 1966, he was given permission basically to live as a hermit on the grounds of Gethsemane. There was a structure out on the grounds that was used for um, uh, ecumenical dialogue among some of the Christian and other denominations, faith denominations in the central Kentucky area. So I think he pestered his abbot at the time was Abbot James Fox to do that. So he continued to explore, read, write. In 1968, he was invited to attend a Asian monastic conference in Bangkok, Thailand. This had profound impact on Merton's in spirituality, his contact with Eastern religions, Buddhism, so forth. He had an opportunity to meet and have conversations with the Dalai Lama, with the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, carried on tremendous amount of correspondence again with him. All of that, his journals, his letters, and all the books that he wrote, or they have been published, of course. And there's 7 volumes of his journals, 3 volumes of his letters, I happen to have one here that, see it, The Hidden Ground of Love, which I have taken a couple selections from for a presentation today. So uh, I want to, that is his life. Whoa, excuse me. In Bangkok, after a conference one afternoon, Merton was accidentally electrocuted. Uh, and uh, by touching a fan by coming out of the shower. Um, that was a shock, of course, to all his friends, associates, the Abbey of Gethsemane, and so forth. So and that occurred. He died on the same date, December 10th, when he entered Gethsemane. So his life is somewhat divided for 26, 27 years before he entered Gethsemane and the 27 years that he was a monk at Gethsemane Abbey. Okay. Before we get into the writings, I wanted to make this comment. That Merton was very familiar with the themes of Catholic social teachings, which I am sure are similar for other Christian denominations and other faith traditions. And you see this in his writings, you read this. Those themes include the dignity of the human person, the importance of family and community, and the participation in each in seeking the common good, protection of the rights and responsibilities of the human person, fundamental option for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity of work, and the rights of workers, solidarity of all humanity in an interdependent world, and care and stewardship of God's creation. His writings touch on so many of those themes. Okay. I'd like to begin with from a selection from a book titled, Merton's book, No Man is an Island, and it's dated 1955. Merton writes, "We do not exist for ourselves alone. It is only when we are fully convinced of this that we begin to love ourselves properly and thus also love others." What do I mean by loving others properly? I mean, first of all, desiring to live, accepting life as a very great gift and a great good, not because of what it gives us, but because of what it enables us to give to others. I think we get a sense that how much Merton valued human relationships and how important it is to be in our lives other-centered, not always concerned about ourselves and needs, but for others. And this is also expressed in this excerpt that he wrote in a book titled Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, one of the best, I think, of Merton's writings. And this in 1964. Merton had several health issues that required him to see doctors in health professions in Louisville. And one of his trips to Louisville in 1964, he writes of his experience. And let me say it. In Louisville, on a corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I was theirs, that I could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. I have the immense joy of being human, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate. As if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, now that I realize what we all are. If only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. The state of Kentucky eventually erected a marker on that spot where Merton is referring to as a state historic marker. I think Walnut Street is now known as Martin Luther King Boulevard, but it's at the same location that Merton refers to in that. Okay, let me share some of his writings on peace and war. It's important to keep in mind when Merton's writing about social justice, you see all the elements, how he merged spirituality and social justice. Yes, he was speaking and writing from a Catholic perspective, but he was so inclusive in his thinking and in his writings. And I also want to say, as we go through some of his writings, I want to share this afternoon, there'll be a brief pause so we can again absorb his words. And I think we all can share the experience that in reading Merton, you read so much and you sit back, and your expression of awe, and just let it resonate with us. I wanted to share this poem that he wrote after he learned of his brothers that he was missing and presumed dead. This was at the middle of World War II. But I think there are some elements that he's sharing that speaks about War and Peace. The poem was published in a book of poetry titled The Strange Islands. And this is 1943. The title, For My Brother, Reported Missing in Action, 1943. Sweet brother, if I do not sleep, my eyes are flowers for your tomb. If I cannot eat my bread, my fast shall live like willows where you died. If in the heat I find no water for my thirst shall turn to springs for you, poor traveler. Where, in what desolate and smoky country lies your poor body, lost and dead? And in what landscape of disaster has your unhappy spirit lost its road? Come in my labor, find a resting place, and in my sorrows lay your head. Or rather, take my life and blood and buy yourself a better bed. Your cross and mine shall tell men still, Christ died on each for both of us. For in the wreckage of your April, Christ lies slain, and Christ weeps in the ruins of my spring. The money of whose tears shall fall into your weak and friendless hand, and buy you back to your own land, the silence of whose tears shall fall. Like cells upon your alien tomb, hear them and come, they call you home. The next selection is Merton taught in a book that he published that's titled Disputed Questions. And it's a conclusion of a chapter titled Christianity and Totalitarianism. Merton writes, our mission in the world is the same as it has always been, to build the kingdom of God, which is the kingdom of love. Love cannot exist except between persons. For there to be love, we must first of all safeguard the liberty and integrity of the human person. We must provide an education that strengthens man against the noise, the violence, the slogans, and the half-truths of a materialistic society. The experience of the past 10 years has shown, or should have shown, that it is not enough to be anti-communist to preserve freedom in America. What will the next years bring? There is unfortunately all too great a danger that it will see the rise of a fatal mass movement for which the moral and cultural disorder of 20th century America have prepared the way only too well. The next selection is taken from one of his most popular spiritual or books on spirituality and contemplation, titled New Seeds of Contemplation. An excerpt from the chapter, "The root of war is fear." When the whole world is in moral confusion, then no one knows any longer what to think. And when, in fact, everybody is running away from the responsibility of thinking. When man makes rational thought about moral issues, observed by exiling himself entirely from realities into the realm of fictions. And when he expands all his efforts in constructing more fictions with which to account for his ethical failures, then it becomes clear that the world cannot be saved from global war and global destruction by the mere efforts of good intentions and peacemakers. In actual fact, everyone is becoming more and more aware of the widening gulf between good purposes and bad results, between efforts to make peace and the growing likelihood of war. It seems that no matter how elaborate and careful the planning, all attempts at international dialogue end in more and more ludicrous failures. In the end, no one has any more faith in those who even attempt the dialogue. On the contrary, the negotiators, with all their pathetic goodwill, become the objects of contempt and hatred. It is in the men of goodwill, the men who have made their poor efforts to do something about peace, who will in the end be the most mercilessly rushed and destroyed as victims of the universal self-hate of man, which they have unfortunately only increased by the failure of their good intentions. Perhaps we will have a basically superstitious tendency to associate failure with dishonesty and guilt. Failure being interpreted as punishment. Even if a man starts out with good intentions, if he fails to tend to think he was somehow at fault, if he was not guilty, he was at least wrong. And being wrong is something we have not yet learned to face with equanimity and understanding. We either condemn it with godlike disdain or forget it with godlike condensation. We do not manage to accept it with human compassion, humility, and identification. Thus, we never see the one truth that would help us begin to solve our ethical and political problems, that we are all more or less wrong, that we are all at fault, all limited and obstructed by our mixed motives, our self-deception, our greed, our self-righteousness, and our tendency to aggression and hypocrisy. Well, that's something to unpack at some point. I mentioned Merton's correspondence with so many people. He got involved in the mid 60s, beginning early 60s, with several individuals who were involved in the peace movement at the time. These were pacifists and those who were opposing the Vietnam War, those who did sit-ins on military bases, who were burning draft cards. A lot of interesting folks, one being Jim Forrest that he corresponded with. Another was with the Jesuit priest Daniel Berrigan and so forth, and many others. Well, Merton would invite a lot of these individuals down to Gethsemane for what he referred to as peace retreats. And they would come on weekends and accommodated in the retreat house and to discuss strategies and plans and so forth. And again, this made his abbot very uncomfortable, but he was allowed to continue. This is a letter, excerpt from a letter that he wrote in response to Jim Forrest. Yes, and it was one of the letters I was referring to earlier in The Hidden Ground of Love. Dated 1963. Merton writes to Forrest, hence the importance of nonviolent people who are really conscientious objectors, not only to nuclear war, but to everything that leads to it or goes with it, in the same general atmosphere of violence and criminality. I think the perspectives of the nonviolent have to be enlarged in all directions so that it becomes a genuine and profound spiritual movement and a force for life in a really rotting and corrupt world. How badly this is needed. In some sense, he was a companion, not physically, but through his writings, and a mentor to so many. I do recall reading that something that shocked Merton when he heard that a student in New York had died in a demonstration by setting himself on fire. He thought it shocked him so much that he began to pull back a little bit and worried that his words sharing with all of these organizers, some of these people he had at Gethsemane, including Joan Baez, were part of the group. They were known as the Catonsville Nine in Maryland. And some of those who are older like myself remember news reports, evening news reports of these activity. Okay. Well, let's shift now to look at Merton's thoughts uh, on racism. Um, the mounting racial and tensions in the U.S. turns Merton's attention to the life of Malcolm X and to the speeches of Martin Luther King. In fact, and he corresponded with Martin Luther King Jr. Excuse me. Martin Luther King Jr. was planning on coming to Gethsemane for a retreat and consultation with Thomas Merton. But he was assassinated 2 weeks before in Memphis, Tennessee. I didn't include that, but his letter to Martin Luther King's widow, Loretta Scott King, is quite moving. This is Merton. I just lost my place here. Excuse me just a second. Here we go. That's my marker here. Again, this is an excerpt from Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander by Merton. And let me say that he uses the term Negro, and also when he writes about the ghetto, that's vocabulary that was used in the 60s. It wasn't until later that we now use African American or inner city, folks who live in the inner city. So again, he writes, fortunately, the Negroes have a leader who is a man of grace, who understands the law of love, who understands the mystery of the greatest secret grace that has been given to the Negro and to no other. The grace which the people who first created the spirituals well know about. The grace of election that made them God's chosen. The grace that elevated them above the meaningless and trivial things of life, even in the midst of terrible and unjust suffering. I want to share with you a section, in fact, it's the foundation of a section of a book written by Merton in 1966 that's titled Seeds of Destruction. And I wanted to comment that at the funeral of Congressman John Lewis a few weeks ago, 3 former presidents gave eulogies. President Bush, President Clinton, and President Obama. In President Clinton's remarks. John Lewis, as we know, was very much involved with the civil rights movement. Clinton pointed out that before the walk across the Emmett Pettus Bridge in Alabama, Lewis was carrying a backpack, anticipating that he would probably be arrested as a result of his participation. He was. In that backpack, the toothbrush, Clinton said, toothpaste, a couple pieces of fruit, and 2 books. One was a copy of Merton's Seeds of Destruction. If you're familiar with it, it makes perfect sense. Well, Lewis would have read this book, and I am assuming that Martin Luther King did too. This is just a bit lengthy, so bear with me. It's titled Letters to a White Liberal. You will say, you cannot legislate morality. That phrase may be quite true in its own proper context. But here, it is a question not of morality, but of social order. If we have got to the point where the laws are frequently, if not commonly, framed in such a way that they can be easily evaded by a privileged group, then the very structure of our society comes into question. If you are knowingly responsible for laws that will be systematically violated, then you are partly to blame for the disorders of the confusion resulting from civil disobedience and even revolution. I think there is possibly some truth in the accusation that we are making laws simply because they look nice on the books. Having them there, we can enjoy the comfort of pointing to them, reassuring our own consciousness, convincing ourselves that we are all that we claim to be, and refuting the vicious allegations of critics who question the sincerity of our devotion to freedom. But at the same time, when our own personal interests and preferences are concerned, we have no intention of respecting the Negro's right in the concrete, north or south. Integration is always going to be not on our street, but somewhere else. That perhaps accounts for the extraordinary zeal with which the North insists upon integration in the South, while treating the Northern Negro as if he were invisible and flatly refusing to let him take shape in full view, lest he demand the treatment due to a human person and a free citizen of this nation. This is why the Negro now insists on making himself just as obviously visible as he can. This is why he demonstrates. He has come to realize that the white man is less interested in the rights of the Negro than in the white man's own spiritual and material comfort. If then by making himself visible, the Negro can finally disturb the white man's precious peace of soul, then by all means, he would be a fool not to do so. Yet when we are pressed and criticized, and when the Negro's violent rights are brought up before us, violated rights are brought up before us, we stir ourselves to renewed efforts at legislation. We introduce more bills into Congress, knowing well enough how much chance those bills have of retaining any real significance after they have finally made it, if they make it at all. The Negro finally gets tired of this treatment and becomes quite rightly convinced that the only way he is ever going to get his rights is by fighting for them himself. But we deplore his demonstrations. We urge him to go slow. We warn him against the consequences of violence, when at least so far, most of the organized violence has been on our side and not on his. At the same time, we secretly desire violence, and in even some cases provoke it, in the hope that the whole Negro movement for freedom can be repressed by force. I do not claim to be a prophet or even a historian. I do not profess to understand all the mysteries of political philosophy, but I question whether our claims to be the only sincere defenders of the human person, of his rights, of his dignity, of his nobility as a creature made in God's image, can be substantiated by our actions. It seems to me that we have retained little more than a few slogans and concepts that have been emptied of reality. It seems to me that we have little genuine interest in human liberty and in the human person. What we are interested in, on the contrary, is the unlimited freedom of the corporation. When we call ourselves the free world, we mean, first of all, the world in which business is free. And the freedom of the person comes only after that, because in our eyes, the freedom of the person is dependent on money. This is to say, without money, freedom has no meaning. And therefore, the most basic freedom of all is the freedom to make money. If you have nothing to buy or sell, freedom is, in your case, irrelevant. In other words, what we are really interested in is not persons, but profits. Our society is organized first and foremost with a view to business, and wherever we run into a choice between the rights of a human person and the advantage of a profit-making organization, the rights of the person will have difficulty getting a hearing. Profit first, people afterwards. Merton continues to write further in that chapter. The real tragedy is that of the white man who does not realize that though he seems to himself to be free, he is actually the victim of the same servitudes which he has imposed on the Negro. Passive subjection to the lotus-eating commercial society that he has tried to create for himself, and which is shot through with falsity and unfreedom from top to bottom. He makes a great deal of fuss about individual freedom, but one may ask if such freedom exists. Is there really a genuine freedom for the person, or only the irresponsibility of the individual members of mass society? This then, according to our Negro writers, is the plight of the white American, and indeed of the whole Western world. Europe cannot save face by sitting back complacently and viewing with pity the conflicts and confusions of white America. When the house next door is on fire, you too are in danger. America does not stand judgment alone. It is the whole white world, including Russia, that stands accused of centuries of injustice, prejudice, and racism. All white men together, in spite of their fantasies of innocence, are prisoners of the same illusion. Seduced by their own slogans, obsessed by the voice of an inner demon, they have no better alternatives than the passivities and oral fantasies of the consumer's dream world and the violent barbarities with which they react. When briefly awakened to all that threatens to contradict their infantile dream. In such a situation, it is absurd for the Negro to place any hope either in the white liberal or in the affluent Negro leader. Though there may be in each of these cases some awareness of the problem, the awareness is not deep enough to mean anything. On the contrary, it only makes matters worse by bringing a new element of delusion into the minds of those concerned. This comes close to being a standard formula in the new Negro literature. It calls white people, white society, before the bar of history and hand down the judgment that it has lamentably failed. Christianity itself is prominently associated in the failure. Without delaying here to make certain distinctions and to defend the basic truth of Christianity, we must admit that the judgment is not altogether without foundation. The practical conduct of many Christians, of whole groups and entire churches, lends it a great deal of support. Christians have perhaps too often been content to delude themselves with vague slogans and abstract formulas about brotherly love. They have too easily become addicted to taking gestures of goodwill and charity, which they have then had taken as a total dispensation from all meaningful action and genuine concern in the crucial problems of our time. As a result, they have become unable to listen to the voice of God in the events of the time and have resisted that voice instead of obeying it. What is the conclusion? The white man is so far gone that he cannot free the Negro because he cannot even free himself. Hence, these books are not in any sense demanding that the whites now finally free the Negroes. On the contrary, The magnificent paradox they uttered is that the Negro has a mission to free the white man. And he can begin to do this if he learns to free himself. His first step to freedom must be the clear realization that he cannot depend on the white man or trust him for anything, since the white man is hopelessly impotent, deluded, and stupefied by his own alienation. Such is the message of the Negro to white America, delivered by men who, to my mind, are the most impressive and inspired writers in our country today. Is the message true? I must say that messages like this cannot be clearly declared to be either true or false until time itself lays out all the evidence before us. But that is precisely our difficulty. We cannot wait. We have to decide now before the truth or falsity of the message becomes evident. We have to be willing to make it evident. The question is then not whether the message is true, but whether it is credible. And to this, I can only give the answer of one man's opinion. Comparing the spiritual earnestness of the message, the creative vitality of the messengers, the fruits of the message, with all the fumbling evasions of those who disbelieve the message, I can come up with no better choice than to listen very seriously to the Negro and what he has to say. I, for one, am absolutely ready to believe that we need him to be free, for our sake, even more than for his own. That, my friends, comes from the voice, the hand of an American Catholic monk. I'm sure he made so many uncomfortable in so many institutions that again, that's why I say I feel that Merton's voice is very much relevant today. Okay. I would like to conclude with two more brief excerpts. Again, from Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. Merton writes, Christian social action is first of all action that discovers religion in politics, religion in work, religion in social programs for better wages, Social Security, etc. Not at all to win the worker for the church, but because God became man, because every man is potentially Christ, because Christ is our brother, and because we have no right to let our brother live in want or in degradation or in any form of squalor, whether physical or spiritual. In a world, if we really understand the meaning of Christianity, in social life, we would see it as part of the redemptive work of Christ, liberating man from misery, squalor, subhuman living conditions, economic or political slavery, ignorance, and alienation. Here again, Merton is writing from a Christian Catholic perspective, and I'm sure other faith traditions, which we'll learn later in this series, will address similar concerns. And then finally, I'd like to share with you this is a prayer that was given to the U.S. Congress at a session back somewhere in 1964 by the chaplain of the House of Representatives. To this Congress, our president, our military forces, and our adversaries, grant us prudence in proportion to our power, wisdom in proportion to our science, humaneness in proportion to our wealth and might, and bless our earnest will to help all races and peoples to travel in friendship with us along the road to justice, liberty, and lasting peace. But grant us above all to see that our ways are not necessarily your ways, that we cannot fully penetrate the mystery of your designs, and that the very storm of power now raging on this earth reveals your hidden will and your inscrutable decision. Grant us to see your face in the lightning of this cosmic storm. O God of holiness, merciful to men, grant us to seek peace where it is truly found. In your will, O God, is our peace. Amen. Speaking of Congress, a couple of years ago, Pope Francis gave an address to U.S. Congress, and he lifted up the names of, noted the three names of Americans. Four he mentioned: Abraham Lincoln, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., and Thomas Merton. He offered them up in reference to thinking of their prophetic message to our country. So, okay. Well, before we open it up for your sharing and comments, you're still with us. Many of you who may be familiar with Merton are aware of these resources. Um, the Merton Center in Louisville, Kentucky, which I made reference to, is a repository of Merton's literary estate. If you're ever in Louisville, I encourage you to visit their Merton room in the library on the campus. There's a small museum there called Artifacts of Merton's, and access to a lot of scholars who do Merton studies and use it as a tremendous resource. Before I do that, there's one point I wanted to mention as we spoke about Merton's biography. His first biographer was John Howard Griffin, who authored Black Like Me. Their Merton Legacy Trust, who makes decisions regarding Merck's literary estate, selected him as Merton's biographer. Griffin was unfortunately died before he concluded his biography. And it was a result, if you recall, Griffin dyed his skin to give the appearance that he was Black, and he lived in Alabama, small town, just to experience for himself the Black experience, which he wrote about in his book. Several years later, Merton Legacy Trust selected Michael Mott, professor of English at Bowling Green University in Ohio, to write the Merton official biography. And he did. It's titled The Seven-Story Mountain of Merton. And it is quite a book. Everything you wanted to know about Merton. Like I mentioned, his life, his prophetic wisdom, his insights and so forth, and things that he experienced in his life to that. But the Merton Center, their website, merton.org, and also you can link to the International Thomas Merton Society that was founded, has a page there. That's something that many of us, I know I'm a member of the International Thomas Merton Society and receive quarterly issues of the Merton Seasonal, what keeps you updated about Merton's writings. There are so many doctoral papers, master's theses on Merton continue to be written. And there's information always about those, all the resources. Another simple access to Merton is Amazon. Many of his books, and there's a couple of videos. One I recommend too, it was done about 20 years ago, Merton, a film biography. It's excellent. Gives you also a visual standing. And I mentioned Merton's photography and his art, his drawings about that. And the second one is a video, DVD, is Soul Searching, the Journal of Thomas Merton. This treats most of Merton's later life, especially his experience when he visited Asia Tibet and Southeast Asia, where he died in Bangkok. And one more resource, many of the tapes that were made of Merton when he was the Master of Novices at Gethsemane have been made available. It used to be called Now You Know Media, but now they changed the name. It's Learn 25. You can find, if you go to their website at learn25, learn25.com / product dash category / Thomas dash Merton. And their whole list comes up that are available for purchasing. Okay. Well, now it is time for all of you to share. So, Geneva, I will turn it over to you to coordinate that.
Thank you, Mike. And I do want to just be mindful of everyone's time, but I want to, because we've gone a little bit over, but I do want to hear from all of you. Thank you for sticking around with us. And I think that we're both curious to hear how Thomas Merton's inspired your life and what you're taking away from this and his perspectives on social justice. I do see a comment in the chat from an iPhone user regarding the impact of Thomas Merton's study of Buddhism on his thoughts and writing. I can't see a name, but did you want to share your comment or question? If the person is still
yes, hi.
okay.
This is Cynthia Cummins. Sorry, I'm used to using my iPad, so I'm still learning how to use all these things on my iPhone. I don't know how to.
Oh, great. Are you with Xavier? I feel like I've seen you before. Okay, yes, wonderful to have you.
Yes, yes, thank you. We actually sponsored an event with Bernard Lafayette a number of years ago, who came in through the Merton Center, and then as I mentioned, I've been on retreat to Gethsemane 9 times and learned of him there, and visited his gravesite and is in the Hermitage, and then saw a sort of a sculptural thing with stones, and I understood that it was across the road, and I understood that it was a Buddhist creation that was related to Merton. And so I learned, that he did study Buddhism, and I just wondered, because I don't always think of him with the overriding term as being Catholic. I think of him as just incredibly spiritual and so many other things that you probably don't have words for. So I was just curious to know how his study of Buddhism might have impacted his life.
I think it did tremendously. He wrote quite a bit in his Asian journal, his experience in Asia. He definitely was able to make a connection between East and West monasticism, for one thing, the similarities. He was able to articulate with Thich Nhat Hanh, and it was reciprocated. We are brothers. I think Merton was so fascinated with Buddhism and its practices that it helped him understand the Christian tradition and Christian mysticism. It helped him articulate that. He could be able to see interesting similarities and working towards this sense of not just all humanity, all creation is one. Help him see the link in all human cultures, all human experiences, and so forth. So we'll talk more about that. Our next section, by the way, is what he articulates even more, and hear it from him. But that's what I'm picking up on what I read so far, that it complemented his sense of unity of all humanity. It was a great experience for him. And he expressed it both in prose and in poetry.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Others?
We do have a request in the chat if you would be willing to share the citations for the readings that were presented. I could email those out if you can send them to me, Mike. Would you be able to do that? Okay.
I'll send those to you, yeah. Yeah, good. Read more about it.
Any other questions or comments? You can unmute yourself.
From my point of view, I imagine I've read his biography about 5 times, and I was absolutely thrilled to find that he ended his life trying to find a sort of common factor between all religions, which to me is very important. And I think what the West, we need so much is the Eastern approach. There's far too much of materialism, and I really long for a more spiritual approach to our Christianity, to our church going, and to equate more with the whole world. I am 95. I've seen a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Besides Buddhism, Merton began a correspondence with several Sufi mystics with Islam. I think he had a similar experience. He talked about this connectedness that he sought and wanted to see through that. And he says many times his eyes were open, his mind was open. I think it's true with all his interactions. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, speaks quite a bit about that in his reading and experience of Merton. So, in fact, the point that you just made in turn, at the 100th commemoration of Merton's death in 2015, the International Thomas Merton Society had a conference at Bellarmine College, and former Archbishop of Canterbury, Williams, was a keynote speaker, and he was making I recall part of his presentation in his talk was exactly what you just mentioned about Buddhism and other world religions. Um, he was very astute and understanding. He was a student of most of the world's religion, but very critical of his own Christianity and Catholic, which is good. He was opening it up.
We have a comment in the chat from Dennis. Did you want to share?
I remember Rowan Williams speaking in Truro Cathedral, and in it he mentioned being ordinary. And afterwards, I went to him and I said, Thomas Merton, and he said yes, because Thomas Merton said, until you realize that you're ordinary, you can't begin. If you think you're special in any way, you cannot begin. And I think that is something we all need to learn.
I agree.
Hello, this is Dennis.
Yes. Hi, Dennis.
Hi. I found the presentation exceedingly well done, and I want to thank you very, very much. It was very enlightening, and also how prophetic he was, not only in his days in the 1960s, but it's so true today. I mean, have we really learned anything in these last 45, 50 years? One wonders. But that, I think, is a sign of a true prophet, to be able to see as clearly as he did back then the situation that we are still currently living through. And just one tiny little clarification, because I did go to Columbia in the 1970s, and I believe the parish where he was baptized was the Church of Corpus Christi on 119th Street. I think you mentioned Christ the King Church.
I'm sorry, you're correct.
But it doesn't change anything. The parish there is, or at least in the 70s when I attended there, was a phenomenal place for theology. Raymond Brown, one of the professors at Union Theological Seminary, often said Mass there. So anyway, thank you again. Very well done.
You're welcome, and thanks for making that correction. Right.
Were there any other comments or questions? If you have a comment, you can unmute yourself or type it in the chat. No, no one else? Well, if we don't have any more questions or comments, and I guess, Mike, did you have any closing thoughts or words that you wanted to leave everyone with today?
I just want to express gratitude for everyone. I agree with Dennis. Merton's voice is very much needed in our times. I think we all can agree. And I encourage you all to become Merton enthusiasts, if not already, because he has quite a lot to say. But I really appreciate this time and opportunity to share a little bit about Merton. I'm hoping to see many of you in a month or so. We will look at his thoughts on interreligious relations, dialogue.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope that you will continue to join us for future programming. If this is your first time joining the Interfaith Center, we have often several programs a week that are offered virtually over Zoom. So I encourage you to look at our calendar at oxfordinterfaithcenter.org, and we will be announcing, we don't have the dates set for the 2 additional parts of this series, but we will send that out, and I will send out the reading bibliography once I receive that from Mike, so you can look at those readings yourself. So thank you all for taking time out of your day, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. And thank you again, Mike.
You're welcome. All
right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.